Turning now to another infamous Boston crime spree, the Boston Strangler. Last week, police exhumed the body of confessed strangler Albert DeSalvo in hopes of definitively linking him to the murder of 19-year-old Mary Sullivan through new DNA testing. For decades, Sullivan's nephew, Sherman, doubted DeSalvo was Mary's killer. And Sherman is here. Welcome, Casey.
Thank you for having me.
Well, this was a very emotional moment for you last week.
It
when
was.
All law enforcement called together that press conference. You had no notice.
I had 24 hours notice of what they were, not what they were going to say, but the fact that they were going to say something. And that morning, they led me through their investigation, showed me what they had uncovered through new DNA testing, and it was quite amazing. You
wrote a book, A Rose for Mary.
Sure.
Based on your belief, your conviction, really, essentially, that Albert DeSalvo was not the murderer of your aunt. She was 19 years old at the time. She's your mother's sister. Why were you so convinced that he did not?
Well, great question. You look at Albert DeSalvo, the criminal, okay? He was never charged with any of the Boston Strangler murders. The only thing that ever tied him to the case was his so-called confession. I uncovered the confession tape a decade ago, put it up to the autopsy reports and the murders, and they did not match up. Albert DeSalvo was confessing to events that never happened. Many of the investigators that worked the case in the 1960s never believed it was Albert DeSalvo. His own lawyer, Tom Troy, after F. Lee Bailey had represented him, never believed it was DeSalvo. His psychiatrist never believed it. In fact, when we did our first DNA examination of Mary's remains in 2000, we believed we'd found the killer's DNA on Mary's body. That DNA did not match Albert DeSalvo. So this turn of events is quite unique.
Yeah, not to be too graphic or specific, but Elaine Whitfield Sharp, who is the DeSalvo family attorney,
Sure.
was on here last week. She says there were two DNA types found on her, one in the pubic area and one in her mouth. And she said that, well, it was Albert DeSalvo's DNA likely that was in her mouth. But she said that doesn't mean he killed her. Are you
I think that's
that?
a stretch.
That's a stretch.
That is an incredible stretch. You know, there was no relationship between Albert DeSalvo and my 19-year-old aunt Mary. If his DNA is at the crime scene, that puts him there at the time she was murdered.
Yeah. What is your family thinking now? I mean, you had somebody in mind. I mean,
Sure.
Mary's boyfriend. I mean,
yeah. Well, it was actually a boyfriend of one of her roommates, and he was the man identified by Boston police in 1964 as the prime suspect in Mary's murder. Here's a guy that failed 2 lie detector tests. Here's a guy that was put at the scene of the crime by a witness. Here's a guy that had an alibi that did not match. And when we did our DNA examination of Mary's remains, the DNA we found on her body was a mitochondrial DNA match to him. So there's still a lot of questions in this case, but I think, putting DeSalvo at the scene of the crime through nuclear DNA tells me that he was there and that he killed her.
So they got DeSalvo's DNA off a water bottle of a nephew,
right,
or something like that. They snatched it from a scene and went and tested it. So male DNA is carried through the Y chromosome, so they know it's a familial match. So what is the point of the exhumation of Albert DeSalvo's body in your mind?
Well, I think that they want to dot their I's and cross their T's. There's 1% of doubt right now that that DNA does belong to Albert DeSalvo. They want to erase that doubt, and I applaud them for it. They're doing their jobs. There's no statute of limitation on murder. Now think about it, Emily. If they really believed Albert DeSalvo was the killer, they wouldn't have gone through this laborious effort to dig him up, test the DNA privately. Many of them said to me, we thought we were going to possibly exonerate him and move on to other suspects. We were kind of surprised when it came back a match, as was I.
Why now? Why are they doing it now? You thought that the case was so cold and no one cared about it. I mean, there's some speculation that's politically motivated because Dan Conley is running for mayor. What do you think?
Yeah, I think D.A. Conley's getting some unjust criticism here. As I said, there's no statute of limitation for murder. I'd say that the person that really kept this case alive within the Boston Police Department is the head of the crime lab, Don Hayes. And he had started to test DNA samples from Mary's murder 10 years ago. The DNA technology wasn't there to glean a positive match on anything, so we halted testing for as long as it took for technology to advance. And he did, and he was, you know, as I said, and I said it in the news conference, it amazed me that my mother and I weren't the only ones thinking of Mary every day for the past 10 years. It was great to know that other people were thinking about it as well. And you look at the role journalism plays in this. You know, the role of journalism is ask those probing questions that lead to positive change, and I think we did that in this case.
Is there relief for you and your mother?
Yeah, you know, I mean, every day it gets better. The initial shock is kind of wearing off, and I think the weight has been lifted from my shoulders, but more from my mother. I mean, my mother was 17 when her 19-year-old sister was stolen from her, and everything that I've ever done in my professional career has been to answer her questions, whether or not it was DeSalvo or not.
Elaine Spark once again said that the family was, she's the attorney for
Sure.
the DeSalvos, said that that family was cooperative, and they are annoyed that they trailed this nephew and picked up his DNA off of a water bottle. Is that true? Were they cooperative? Were they uncooperative?
Well, I think had law enforcement reached out to the DeSalvos early on and requested DNA, there probably would have been a battle there. I don't think the DeSalvos would have raised much of an uproar, if you will, had the DNA test came back a little differently. That being said, I think the DeSalvos are a great family. They're full with honest people that do their jobs every day. You know, as I said in the news conference, they're victims of Albert DeSalvo's crime too, and I don't want anybody to cast aspersions on the DeSalvos because, like my family, they were just looking for the answers.
It is such a distinctive name. Well, F. Lee Bailey, the original attorney that you referenced, who became well known also through the O.J. Simpson trial, he believed Albert DeSalvo was. He said, you know, despite some of those mismatches in the confession that you found, he said he knew too much. There were just too many specifics that he couldn't have gotten from the newspaper.
Well, he proved to be right in Mary Sullivan's case. Now, you've got 10 other homicides that I think the law enforcement agencies are going to start to look at a little bit more because, again, there are so many, you know, glaring errors in the investigation from the 1960s and so many questions about whether or not DeSalvo was the only killer of these women or if there were copycats at play. Because the crime scenes were so vastly different, a lot of the investigators believed that copycats were at play. But I think now with modern technology, they can answer these questions for the families, and they seem to be at least diligent in doing so.
Well, can they? Because they seem focused on Mary Sullivan, but is there DNA left from the other cases that you know?
I'm not 100% positive on that, but you know, I think they'll start to look down those avenues if in fact other families, you know, raise those questions as well. But you know, from what I've seen, and I've had a contextual relationship with law enforcement regarding this case for years. That's why I was so shocked and so happy that the new people in power, like your Dan Connolly, like your Commissioner Davis, like your Martha Coakley, they looked at it objectively, as I would, and they said, here's what we have. We want you to be a part of this. We want you to know about it. And, you know, we want justice for Mary as you did.
All right. Casey Sherman, thanks for coming.
Thank you, Emily.